He wasn't dying. He was waking up. Rain sluiced down the cracked glass of the bus stop shelter, a silver curtain blurring the restless lights of the city. Mara Ellis pulled her hood tighter and hugged the takeout bag against her chest, as if the fading warmth could pass through her soaked jacket and reach her bones. The hospital had kept her late again, and her feet ached from 12 hours of running between rooms filled with people who screamed, wept, and whispered bargains to gods she didn't believe in. There was nothing heroic about the night shift. It was just survival. One patient, one heartbeat, one paycheck at a time. Yet even now, when she could barely keep her eyes open, she couldn't walk past pain without stopping. It was the curse of her nature, the one thing that hadn't been crushed by exhaustion or debt or the gray indifference of the city. The street was almost empty, the kind of emptiness that made sound travel differently, sharper, as though every drop of rain had a secret to tell. That was when she heard it, a low, broken gasp that didn't belong to the wind. It came from the alley beside the shuttered bookstore, a narrow throat of darkness pulsing with the reflection of passing headlights. Mara hesitated. Every instinct warned her to keep walking, to mind her own business, but something about the sound tore through her fatigue. It wasn't the rough groan of a drunk or the mutter of someone lost to madness. It was the sound of a man fighting to stay alive. She took one step, then another, until she stood at the mouth of the alley. He lay slumped against the brick wall, half hidden beneath a collapsed cardboard box, rainwater pooling around him like a thin sheet of mercury. His clothes were torn, but not in the random way of streetwear. They looked like remnants of something once fine. Dark wool, frayed velvet, buttons carved with tiny sigils that no factory had made in centuries. His skin was so pale, it seemed almost translucent under the streetlight, the veins beneath faintly visible, like blue ink beneath frosted glass. His hair clung to his face, black and wet, and when he lifted his head, she saw the impossible color of his eyes. Not red, not exactly, but the deep shade of garnet held to a flame. Mara's pulse quickened. She had seen every kind of wound in her short career, from overdose to knife fights, but nothing looked like this. A gash ran across his ribs, too clean and too precise. The edges blackened as though burned. It wasn't bleeding normally. The fluid that seeped out was darker, thicker, as if time itself had curdled it. He watched her approach without fear or plea, only a strange resignation. "Don't touch me," he whispered, the voice rough, cracked, older than the body that held it. But she was already kneeling, already tearing open the hem of her own sleeve to use as a bandage. "Save your strength," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady. "You've lost a lot of blood." "What happened?" He tried to answer, but the words dissolved into a coughing fit that left his lips stained with something darker than crimson. When he sagged forward, she caught him by instinct, feeling the unnatural chill of his skin seep through her hands. He was colder than the rain, not dead, not alive, but suspended somewhere between. Mara looked toward the street. No pedestrians, no sirens, no help, and knew she had made her decision the moment she'd stepped into the alley. With effort, she dragged him to his feet, slinging his arm over her shoulder. He was heavier than he looked, solid in a way that made her knees shake, yet she refused to let go. The scent of iron filled the air, faint but persistent, like rust and roses. By the time they reached her apartment 2 blocks away, she was shaking from exhaustion. Her keys slipped twice before she managed to open the door, guiding him into the dim light of her single-room flat. The place was small, 1 bed, 1 table, a flickering lamp. But it was warm, and tonight that was enough. She helped him onto the couch and turned on the small heater by the wall. "You need a doctor," she said, though she knew what his answer would be. "No hospitals," he rasped, his eyes unfocused, but sharp with something that wasn't pain. "Promise me." Mara frowned. "You'll die without help." He looked at her. Then, really looked, and the intensity of that gaze made her throat tighten. "You have no idea what I am," he said softly, "but you will." She ignored the warning. Habit took over, the automatic rhythm of triage, of survival. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, pressed gauze against the blackened edges, wrapped it tight. The smell of burnt flesh was faint, but wrong, carrying a sweetness that made her stomach twist. He didn't flinch, though his eyes darkened, the pupils dilating until they nearly swallowed the color. When she brushed his hair back to check his pulse, her fingers grazed the edge of a scar along his neck, shaped like a crescent, torn by claws. "Who did this to you?" she asked. "Old enemies," he said after a long pause. "Older than you can imagine." Something about the way he said it made her shiver, yet she couldn't stop herself from asking, "Why would they hurt you like this?" His lips curved, not in a smile, but in something close to pity. "Because I refuse to die." Mara sat back, studying him. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling like distant drums. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a strange calm, as if her fear had no place in the same room as his presence. When she turned to fetch him water, he caught her wrist, gently, but with a strength that froze her mid-motion. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "Because you're hurt," she said simply. "That's not reason enough," he murmured. "It is for me." For the first time, something flickered across his face, a shadow of confusion, maybe even disbelief. He released her hand, and she noticed the faint trace of frost where his fingers had touched. When she brought him the cup, he didn't drink. He watched the reflection of the room in the water's surface, as though it revealed things the human eye couldn't see. Minutes stretched. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. His breathing slowed until she feared it would stop altogether. Then, without warning, the light in the room dimmed, not the bulb, but the air itself, thickening like fog. Mara's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She leaned closer, reaching for the bandage, and his eyes snapped open. The pupils had narrowed into slits. The garnet hue burned brighter than any fever. For one breathless instant, she saw him not as a dying man, but as something ancient and terrible pretending to be human. Then the light returned, and he was only a stranger again, pale and trembling. She stepped back, heart racing. "You need rest," she said quickly. I'll stay up. Make sure you don't slip into shock." "You shouldn't stay," he whispered. "Too late." He closed his eyes. "Then may your mercy forgive what it wakes." She didn't understand. She just watched him drift into uneasy sleep, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. The rain outside softened to a steady whisper, and for a moment the world felt fragile, balanced on the edge of something vast. She sat in the chair across from him, arms wrapped around herself, listening to the distant hum of the city and the faint crackle of the heater. Her eyelids grew heavy. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of a throne buried beneath the sea, of voices whispering in a language older than light, and of a man with eyes like garnet watching her from across a field of bones. She woke to silence. The couch was empty. Only a faint smell of iron remained. And on the table beside the water glass lay a ring, black iron, engraved with a broken crown that shimmered faintly even in the dim light. It was warm when she picked it up, then cold, so cold it burned her skin. She didn't know then that the ring was a seal once worn by kings, that her blood now pulsed faintly within its metal, binding her to a destiny she had never asked for. She only knew that somewhere in the city, the man she'd saved was no longer dying. He was waking up. The storm returned with the dusk, as if it had only stepped outside to breathe, and now came back with purpose. And Mara, who had spent the day carrying the iron ring in her pocket like a live ember, tried not to think about the way the metal cooled and warmed with her mood, or how the edges of her dreams clung to her in waking hours like seaweed after a near drowning. And when she unlocked her door, she told herself that the emptiness she felt was only fatigue until the air stirred and the lamp dimmed without losing power, and the shadow by the window separated from the night to stand up and become the man she had pulled from an alley, as though he had never been anything but a silhouette waiting for a body. And she did not scream, because the instinct to triage was older than fear, though her hand tightened around her keys the way a child grips a talisman, and he watched her with an attention so complete it felt like pressure, like an altitude change inside her chest. He wore different clothes, dark wool that had not touched water in a very long time, a collar without lint, buttons that had not been mass-produced but carved, and the wound she had bandaged was gone, not faded or stitched, but erased, as if history had been rewritten, and he had walked out of the past without the night that should have killed him. And for a heartbeat, she wanted to laugh, because no human body heals like that. And then he said her name, which she had not given him, said it the way a church bell says a town's name at noon, unhurried and absolute. Mara. He did not thank her, did not ask permission to be in her home, did not apologize for turning the room colder by degrees, simply by standing still. He looked around with the wariness of a hunted thing and the scorn of a king denied the right to hide. And when his gaze found the ring where she had set it on the table before leaving for her shift, it sharpened into something that could cut, and the shadows along the wall leaned toward the ring as if it were a small sun. She started to ask how he was alive and why he had returned. But he moved faster than conversation and took her wrist with a precision that was not cruel and not gentle, neither violence nor tenderness, only claim, and the temperature of her skin changed under his touch in a way that made her think of stepping into a winter stream, and he lifted her hand until the ring lay directly beneath it, and said in a voice that did not belong to a stranger, "Do you know what this is?" And when she said that she knew only that it was his, and that he had left it like a promise or a threat, he smiled in that terrible way people do when they hear a lovely misunderstanding, and the air around them thickened with the scent of iron and smoke and something resinous she could not name, and he told her that the ring was not a trinket or a memory, but a seal bound with oaths older than the street outside, that it answered only to the living blood that woke it, and for the first time she understood that he had not merely left it, he had been compelled, or perhaps the ring had chosen its next keeper, and whichever of them had agency, it was not her. She pulled her wrist back, the pulse hammering against his fingers, and told him that he was frightening her, which was true, and that he needed to leave, which was brave, and he tilted his head as if listening to a distant choir, and said in a tone that broke no argument that he would leave when she ordered him with the ring to go, that this was the way of ancient permissions, that the one who held the seal could dismiss a king or call him to heel, and the light bulb in the lamp moaned, and brightened and moaned again, because the building was not meant to hear that kind of sentence spoken aloud. She told him she didn't want to command anyone, and didn't know what he was talking about, and then her vision slipped for a moment, just a fraction, like a film sliding off its sprockets, and in that stagger of reality she saw not the cramped apartment with its chipped paint and bargain furniture, but a hall of black stone glistening with the condensation of subterranean rivers, braziers burning a wine-dark flame, a ceiling held up by pillars scored with bites and oaths, and at the far end, a throne not empty but in ruin, its arms shattered by rage, its seat polished by centuries, and a crowd that had fled or been slain. And in the middle of the floor, a broken crown that matched the shape on the ring, and her knees softened because her brain could not hold two buildings at once, and he caught her elbow so she didn't fall, and said, softer this time, almost human, "You felt it." And she whispered that she didn't want to feel anything that wasn't hers, and he said that the bond would not care what either of them wanted, that her act of mercy had completed a condition written when empires were still rumors, that the curse designed to end him had hooked itself to her instead like a fish swallowing a barbed star, that he had slept, wrapped in iron for longer than she could count, poisoned by silver fire and words shaped like knives, and that the only salve was human touch given freely, not purchased, not tricked, and that her stitching, her hands, her refusal to walk away had taught the iron to forgive him, and now her blood lived in the seal, and the seal lived in him, and he lived in her like a second, colder pulse. She told him to stop talking about her blood as if it were a key someone else owned, and that if there was a curse, then maybe it could be undone by the same compassion that had woken it, and that she was 10 minutes from calling the police regardless of his eloquence. And this time he laughed, a low sound that made the window pane tremble in its frame, not because he thought her powerless, but because he had seen how little such institutions mattered when treaties were inked in centuries, and the laws of men lived only as long as men. And he said that if she called them, she would make their deaths her inheritance, which was melodrama, until the hallway outside responded with a scuff of footsteps that did not belong to her neighbors. Footsteps that held discipline, that carried the lean patience of hunters waiting for a signal. And he turned his head toward the door, and his face changed the way a continent changes on a fault line. Not a new mask, but the revelation of an old one. And she realized that the leather of his restraint had always been thin. He crossed the room and stood with his palm against the door, as if feeling the heartbeat of whoever waited. And the silence on the other side learned how to listen back. He closed his eyes and said a name that tasted like ash and frost, not to her, but to the night beyond the peephole, and whatever stood in the hallway did not move again. He told her that his enemies had scented the seal reawakened, that they would come and speak through mouths that apologized and wore uniforms, that they would bring priestly symbols and legal papers and a softness that could smother. And he said it would be easier for everyone if she handed him the ring, and ordered him to forget her, and go, that there were places he could hide, and burn his life down on his own terms, and leave her to her serious, mortal kindnesses, that this was not her war, and there was no shame in refusing to be conscripted by an accident of mercy. She should have said yes, and opened her palm, and ended the story at the doorstep. But she remembered the alley, the impossible wound, the way his eyes had changed, and then changed back, the way he had warned her before he knew her name, the way the couch had held his weight like a confession, and something inside her made a quieter decision than fear could reach. She asked him why he thought she would survive handing the ring to a man hunted by a world she did not understand, and whether his enemies would not assume she had been his accomplice simply because she had touched the seal, and how she would protect her patience and her rent and the tired little life she had built if whispers began to follow her through the hospital corridors, and whether he intended to sleep in alleys forever like an emperor practicing humility. And the corner of his mouth lifted in a recognition of a kind of courage he had apparently not expected from a woman who ironed her scrubs at midnight. He said the word, "please," and the wind crawled under the sill as if to hear it. and he asked her to listen with her pulse, not her fear, and he told her his name like an oath offered for witnessing. Lucian, not chosen, but earned, the last of a line that had mistaken endurance for immortality. And he said that if she kept the ring, she held a sovereign's consent in iron, and if she spoke to him with it, he would obey, and if she sent him away with it, he would be unmade, and if she wore it without understanding, the city would remake itself around her, like water deepening around a stone. She realized then that the apartment smelled faintly of winter roses, a scent her grandmother had worn in a town that no longer appeared on maps, and the memory startled her because it did not belong to the room or the rain or the city, and in that moment, she was tired of accidents that felt like prophecies, so she said that if he needed a place to be safe, he could have her couch for one night under one condition, that he answer truthfully when she asked what had tried to kill him and why it had failed, and he inclined his head as if receiving terms of surrender from an equal, and said that he had been betrayed by a sworn brother who had bartered his kingdom for a promise of sunrise, and that it had failed because the curse required him to die alone, and he had not, and because a stranger had chosen compassion in a world that had almost forgotten the use of it, and that such acts bend architecture and law and sometimes even blood. And he looked at the ring and then at her and added that there would be a cost she could not yet count, that the bond always collects, and that he would spend himself against that cost before he let it take her. The footsteps in the hallway retreated, not in fear, but in calculation, leaving behind the memory of a patient predator, and Lucienne stepped away from the door, and the room exhaled, and Mara finally set the ring on her finger because pretending she did not already wear it in every decision felt childish, and the iron lay against her skin like a circle of cool breath, and the lamp steadied, and the rain on the fire escape became an orchestra section learning to wait, and they stood across from each other like two countries deciding whether to wage a war or forge a treaty. And when she said that they would speak in the morning because her shift would start in 6 hours and she still needed to sleep, he did not argue, only crossed to the window and stayed there like a sentry whose heartbeat was the measure of night. And she lay down without taking off her shoes because there are thresholds you cross with small rebellions, and when the city sighed itself into the depth of evening. Her last thought before sleep found her was not of fear or wonder, but of the strange way his name had settled inside her chest, like a key in a lock that had been waiting for years to be turned. Dawn crept in as a gray smear that could not quite dissolve the night clinging to the corners of the room, and Mara woke to the sense that someone had been standing over her for a long time without breathing, and the knowledge settled not as panic, but as a strange steadiness, because some part of her had accepted that she was no longer the only pulse that mattered inside these walls. Lucienne had not moved from the window, yet the air around him had changed, as if the city's first light were pushing through his outline and pooling on the floor in a shape that did not obey glass or angle. And when she sat up, the ring tightened faintly, not painfully, more like a reminder from a watchful hand, and she realized with a shock that it was not. The metal that clung to her, but the promise folded into it, and that promise had teeth. He turned before she spoke, and the tired elegance in the way he faced her told her he had kept vigil because he did not yet trust sleep, not his own and not the world's. And when he asked if she had dreamed, the question brushed her nerves like a bow across strings and drew out the memory she had hoped to hide from herself. A corridor of basalt where portraits had been carved straight into the stone, faces eroded by centuries of salt air that could not possibly exist underground, a woman with a hair like spill water bending over a cradle, a lullaby in a language Mara had never heard and yet could hum now if asked, and a crown hammered into an hourglass to mark the patience of the damned. She said yes, but only after she had reminded him that she did not want visions as payment for charity, and he inclined his head, receiving the rebuke as if it were a royal writ, and told her that what she had seen were memories seeping through a seam he had not been strong enough to seal. Not messages or commands, only sediment stirred by the ring learning its new owner. The word owner snapped in the air between them like a brittle twig, and she told him very carefully that if any part of this arrangement imagined itself ownership of her hours, her body, her choices, then it would learn how loudly a mortal woman could say no, and the smallest smile tugged at his mouth, not of amusement but of relief that she would not let the bond turn into a leash, and he answered that the bond was law, not leash, and that law cut both ways, and if it demanded anything, it demanded that he keep her breathing, no matter the cost, which was either chivalry or a sentence depending on how the next hour unfolded. She had to go to the hospital. Lives that did not involve broken thrones depended on her. The ring pulsed once, a cold pulse that felt like a heartbeat inside metal, and he flinched as if struck by a sound too high for her to hear. And then he said that she could go, and that he would follow at a distance no one could measure. And she said he would not to a public building where a rumor could kill as surely as a stake, and the conversation might have become an argument if the air had not changed with sudden, surgical precision, the way a room changes when a pressure door seals in an operating theater, and both of them turned toward the hallway before the first knock came. It was a polite knock, the kind delivered by people who inhabit offices with rugs that cover the whole floor, and a woman's steady voice identified herself as building management accompanied by city services performing a welfare check, and the words were careful and practiced and almost convincing, except for the breath between syllables, a breath that had been trained out of normal speech because normal lungs are not required to breathe. Lucian watched Mara watching the door, and the ring chilled, as if remembering a winter it had once survived, and he said without moving that if she opened it, uninvited, they would pour in like water and never leave, and that only she could invite them, because the seal recognized her as threshold, and she asked him with more bravery than sense if he expected her to live forever with an unopened door, and he said that for the next 5 minutes, yes. The second knock carried no voice behind it, and she felt the presence beyond the wood lean forward like a question. The ring burned cold against the inside of her finger, and the burn translated itself to language she had no words for, a pattern of pressure that felt like a map of boundaries, and her body, without asking her permission, knew how to answer. She lifted her hand with the ring and spoke one sentence. She did not know she knew, a sentence that sounded like cracked ice sliding under a moon, and the pressure outside the door withdrew with a hiss that the human ear could not have heard if the walls had not chosen to speak it. When the silence returned, it had edges, and he exhaled so slowly it took a moment for her to realize he had been withholding air, and she stared at her own palm in a mixture of triumph and horror because she had just done something that had no place. In a city she understood, and the moral mathematics that had governed her life, do no harm, tell the truth, pay your bills, had acquired a new variable in the shape of a ring. He moved then, not toward her, but toward the table where she kept the coffee tin and the stack of unpaid envelopes, and without touching anything, he said that the bond had taken root, and choices would begin to grow from it, whether she watered them or not, that he could feel his hunger waking like a dormant muscle, not for her blood, which he swore he would never ask, but for the order her presence brought to the ruin in him, a quiet he had not known since his queen sang him toward dawn the night before she died. The comparison sliced the morning cleanly into before and after, and she heard herself say that she wasn't a queen and would not become a substitute for a dead woman. And he shook his head, saying softly that she wasn't a substitute for anything, that the ring did not copy, it chose. And it had chosen a nurse who stitched strangers with cheap thread and stood between violence and vulnerability as a profession. And if she wanted to call that destiny, he would bow to the poetry of it. And if she wanted to call it coincidence, he would call it obedience and live with the taste of humility in his mouth. She thought of her grandmother humming while pressing a cold cloth to a fevered brow, of the careful attention demanded by a needle sliding through skin without leaving a jagged scar, of the way she had learned to tell the truth gently enough that it did not shatter people who could not afford another break. And she felt something inside her unclench, not surrendering to him, but to the idea that perhaps her life had been rehearsing for this without telling her, and she said that if the bond required terms, then they would write them together right now. No feeding on anyone in her building, no bodies, no breaking the minds of the curious who asked the wrong questions at the wrong time, no vanishing for days without warning while leaving, her to fend off polite knocks and impolite silences, and he took each term as if it were an oath and returned with one of his own, that if he said run, she would run. And if he said, do not speak, she would not speak. Not because he demanded silence, but because there are moments when sound itself becomes a weapon turned against the throat that makes it, and that trust without a blade at its back must cut a path through both their natures. The ring warmed at that. Not a reward, but approval. And she made coffee because the human body is not improved by prophecy on an empty stomach. And while it brewed, he told her as much as she demanded, and no more. That he had ruled a court that did not see the sky, that his people had learned to call cruelty law and isolation pride. That he had tried to be less monstrous than the crown wanted, and more monstrous than his heart could stand. That a friend had sold him to a sect devoted to the fantasy of a son that could be bribed, and that silver lit with scripture had burned him into a statue that could not die. And in that pause, she understood the worst part, which was not his pain, but the length of it, a duration no human metabolism was designed to imagine. He told her that he could stand in her room now only because she had taught the iron that mercy was possible, and a law older than curses recognized the loophole and opened like a door, and that what he needed from her was not blood or worship, but proximity. Her presence stitched the rent where his hunger poured through. Her voice slowed the heartbeat of the monster he had refused to name. And if she walked away, that heartbeat would drown him until only the killing remained, which would make him efficient and useless, a king capable of nothing but ending. The ethics of that lay before her like a set of instruments on a tray. Sterile, shining, dangerous in the wrong hands. And she considered the question not as romance, but as triage. Could she keep him from becoming what the world expected of him long, enough to find a better room to breathe in? And could she do it without losing the pieces of herself she needed to hand back at the end of every shift? Her phone chimed. Her day intruded. The hospital would not wait for a queenless kingdom to find its conscience. She set the mug down and told him he could not follow her, but he could walk her to the corner. And if he felt the need to prove that he could protect without being seen, he could do it by staying out of view, and he nodded once, a gesture that might have been a bow if he had bent any farther. And when they stepped into the stairwell, the lights behaved themselves out of fear. Or respect. She could not tell which. Outside, the rain had finished scouring the street, and left behind a sheen that turned the city into a rumor of itself. and as they walked, her pulse learned the rhythm of his stride, the way a metronome teaches time to a pianist, not matching but conversing, and she found it infuriatingly comforting that the crowd did not notice him even when he passed within arm's length, as though the city had decided he was a long-standing architectural feature that did not require annotation. At the corner, he stopped, not because the bond demanded it, but because the terms they had written did, and the ring cooled as if acknowledging a border respected, and he looked at her with that grave attention he reserved for the moments when he risked, sounding like a man and not a legend, and said that if anyone in a uniform asked for her cooperation, she was to say that she had not seen anything but rain, and if anyone with eyes like smoky glass offered her sanctuary, she was to refuse, and if anyone with a voice like velvet asked to borrow the ring for an hour, she was to run without asking why. She said she would try, which was the only honest answer, because the world she knew prized compliance over caution, and velvet voices often came attached to signing bonuses. And he smiled, truly this time, the kind of smile that knew the cost of humor and paid it anyway. And he lifted her hand and did nothing more than breathe on the ring, and the metal caught a light that was not the sun, a light that braided itself into the iron like a promise. And he said that if she ever needed him, she had only to speak his name as though it belonged to her, and the ring would translate the rest. She left him there, a shadow tender to its own edges, and the city took her back with the clatter of buses and the smell of bakery steam and the sound of people pretending they would live forever. And every time she moved, the ring reminded her that. Her pulse now had an echo, and by noon, she had already discovered the first consequence of their pact. The boy in triage, who had been thrashing in a panic attack, calmed the moment her hand touched his shoulder. Not the usual easing that comes from kindness, but a sudden quiet as if a storm cell had shifted east of his skull. And she knew it was not her alone, because she felt, faintly, a second steadiness reach through her skin and lend a little portion of night to the overheated day. And Lucian, wherever he had chosen to hide the afternoon, must have felt the same transfer, because a message bloomed on her phone without a sender, only a line of text that should not have been able to root through any network. Good. Teach it mercy. I will endure. When her shift ended, she walked home slowly, testing the edges of her breath, and at the last light, she saw him standing across the street, as if he had grown there. The ring warmed in greeting, and she realized the hierarchy of need had inverted since the alley. It was not that a monster required a nurse, but that a kingdom required someone who believed the body could be coaxed back to life if the bleeding were stopped and the infection named out loud. She did not say any of this as she crossed to him. She did not have to. The bond had learned the vocabulary of her silence, and when they reached the door, he asked for nothing but the truth of whether she would continue, and she said yes. For tonight? And he bowed as if granted a reprieve, and above them the sky considered a star and decided to swallow it again. And inside the apartment, the ring hummed on the table where she set it to cool, and the city drew its curtains, one window at a time, while a human and a king practiced the art of standing near each other without breaking what the other carried. The city swallowed the week as if time were a warm coin under its tongue. And by the seventh dusk, Mara had learned to measure her life, not in shifts and sleep, but in the quiet radii of safety that Lucian drew around her, invisible circles that moved. When she moved, obedient to the ring and to a set of terms spoken over coffee like liturgy, and yet even within those circles the pressure built, an atmospheric ache that warned of weather. No forecast could name, because rumors spread faster than infection, when the body that carries them is a court that has forgotten how to kneel without drawing blood, and somewhere beneath the reservoir and the old rail yards and the weight of 100 years of concrete, voices began to gather in a place that was older than the city and younger than the last decent law, and those voices spoke with the impatience of immortals forced to share oxygen with mortals who insist on hope. It started with the envelope slipped beneath her door, the paper thick and soft as skin, the handwriting elegant enough to be threatening, a faceless invitation to leave the apartment at twilight and bring the ring to a neutral meeting where mutual good faith would be demonstrated. And when Mara showed it to Lucian, he did not touch the paper, as if the ink were an infection. And he said that neutral was the word a knife uses when it wants to befriend a throat. And then he told her that the time had come to stop pretending this could be managed in rooms with windows and dishes and bills, that there was a place stronger than locks and wiser than alarms, where the bond would be honored by stone and oath, a sanctuary built when his people still remembered that safety is a promise before it is a wall. The entrance was where no map gave it permission to be, a door disguised as a utility hatch in a tunnel whose only light came from maintenance bulbs that hummed like insects. And when he unlocked the disguised mechanism with a whisper, Mara felt the ring heat and then cool, as if acknowledging the threshold. And she understood, without being told, that her blood carried the only key that mattered. The door sighed open, and the air that spilled out tasted like iron and river water and the dust of hymns, and they stepped into a descent that had not been used since the city learned to climb. The sanctuary did not offer beauty first. It offered honesty, a cathedral of basalt and mortar whose arches had been carved by hands that had built prisons and palaces and tired of the difference, a long nave lined by sconces that woke at their approach with a light that was not flame and not electricity, but a patient glow, and in the center, an expanse of floor inlaid with sigils that looked like astronomical charts for a sky that refused to be seen, and at the far end, a dais that had once held a throne and now held nothing but a circle of empty chairs, because the throne had been shattered by the same rage that had left a broken crown on an alley of memory. Lucian's voice carried differently in that place, not louder, but truer, as if the room corrected the acoustics of his history, and he explained what the stone already knew. No vampire could cross the outer threshold without an invitation that bore the ring's authority. No command spoken by him alone could break that rule. No oath could be forced, and any power raised against the sanctified within would recoil as if it had slammed into a mirror, which meant that if she said the word home, the Vuai sanctuary would hear and obey until someone betrayed the grammar of the promise, and if she said the word leave, he would obey even if the command scraped him raw. She asked who else knew of this place, and he told her that once it had been the heart of his court, a neutral ground where rivals could argue without drawing steel, a monastery with teeth, a parliament that could not agree whether mercy was strategy or weakness, and that after his fall it had been sealed and forgotten. Or so he had made himself believe, because forgetting is the easiest form of burial. And he looked at the empty chairs like a man counting ghosts, and said he would not lie. Others would remember, and others would come. Word travels in eddies and back channels, and the first messenger reached them before midnight in the shape of a cleric whose robes had faded to the color of old bruises. He stopped at the boundary where the sigils began, bowed the way you bow when you fear a door will decide you aren't worth crossing, and asked leave to speak on behalf of a council that had reassembled itself in the dark, like bone knitting badly after a break. And Lucian granted speech, but not entry, and the talk that followed tasted like legal dust and altar smoke, a negotiation about titles and lineages and the price of amnesty for those who had attended the betrayal, but not the binding. And Mara watched the way Lucien stood, the way he kept his hand still, the way he refused every attempt to turn her into abstraction, the mortal, the bond spark, the proximity, and insisted instead on her name until the cleric spoke it with the careful pronunciation of a man laying a sword back into its scabbard. And when the terms reached the subject of her authority in this room, the ring tightened on her finger, and the floor answered with a barely audible thrum, as if to remind the visitor that thresholds are conversations, not corridors. They came in ones and twos over the next nights. An advocate who offered to arrange a painless dissolution of the bond in exchange for the ring, and a public apology that would restore the myth of a king's invulnerability. A girl with ink on her fingers who claimed to be a chronicler and asked permission to hear the truth so she could write it down before it was replaced by the version with better metaphors. A captain of the city's undercrews who cared nothing for crowns but everything for stability and wanted guarantees that the dead would not begin to clutter his docks, and even a courier who delivered a velvet box containing a daylight stone that would allow Lucien an hour beneath the sun if he would swear to exile the nurse who was becoming a rumor that made young vampires question the loyalty they owed to hunger. In every case, the sanctuary enforced the rule, and no one crossed the sigils without Mara's yes, and every time she withheld it, she felt the smallest shock of power dance across her bones, a static of responsibility she did not enjoy and could not yet relinquish. Somewhere between the arguments and the offers, and the carefully veiled threats, Lucien began to change in ways that startled her more than his first transformation. Not because he became softer, but because his patience sharpened, because he started to hear subtext, the way a physician hears an arrhythmia, and turned questions back on their askers with a precision that made liars touch their throats. Because he chose twice to say, "I was wrong," when it would have cost him less to snarl. And because he let her interrupt him, not as courtesy, but as praxis, as if he were teaching the room how to watch someone with a mortal span of years speak with authority that exceeded her clock. In the pauses, when the consecrated quiet expanded, he walked her through the structure of the court as it had been, and the fractures as they were now, drew maps in dust, and spoke names like diagnoses. Varen the Scarlet, who preached purity but invested in smuggling rings that trafficked panic like a spice. Sarah of the Three Vows, who had once saved a village from a fire and now fed on their gratitude until it curdled. The faceless brokers, who would gladly sell a king to buy an hour of daylight for their sons, and the handful who had knelt only once in their lives and would do so again if given a reason that made them proud instead of ashamed. It should have been intoxicating, that education and power, but the sanctuary had its own pedagogy, and it taught Mara to distrust the thrill that accompanies influence, to notice the way her posture straightened when someone said, "My lady," and to bend it back toward humility before the room misunderstood and made it permanent. And it taught her that listening creates a debt, and if she did not pay it with discernment, she would end up paying it with blood. The first tangible hint of betrayal came as a contradiction, small enough to hide in a sentence, when a messenger swore no one outside the court knew of their location, and later, in the same breath, offered to improve the wards in exchange for the ring's imprint on his tongue, and Mara watched the pupils dilate in a way that meant he had been coached to remember a story that did not belong to him. And when she denied him entry, she made it sound like compassion, but the ring answered with frost along the edge of the sigil circle, and the messenger left with his smile intact and his plans revised. That night, Lucian stood at the dais and looked as tired as a man who had decided to live, which is always more exhausting than deciding to die. And he said the thing he had been avoiding. There was a traitor planted not among their visitors, but among the tiny cohort of guardians he had allowed to wake and watch the tunnels beyond the outer threshold. A loyalist who had survived the Old Fall by learning to mimic loyalty. And while he spoke, Mara realized that the footsteps outside her apartment, the polite knock with trained breath, the envelope that appeared without a shadow to deliver it, had all been part of a map drawn by someone with access to blueprints he should not have seen. She asked the only question that mattered. What happens if the traitor convinces someone with her face or her voice to invite them in? And the sanctuary heard and dimmed its lights until even her human eyes could see the fine seams in the stone, like cracks in enamel, and Lucian answered that the rule would hold until the invitation matched the ring, that mimicry could reach only as far as the outer hall. And then he added, quiet enough that the room had to lean closer, that the faster they tried to fortify, the more loudly they would advertise their fear. And fear draws war like sugar draws ants. Decision ripened like fruit left too long on a windowsill, and she plucked it before it rotted. She would speak to the council directly, and she would do it here, under the law of the sanctuary, with the sigils awake and the oath recorded on stone, and she would tell them that she had no intention of wearing a crown, that she sought no throne, that her terms were narrow and humane, to keep hospitals safe from raids, to bar feeding and coercion within 3 blocks of any shelter, to protect messengers even when they carried bad news, to demand that those who wanted peace prove it by tending to the bruised edges where peace begins. And then she would say the harder thing, that if the court chose war, she would not abandon Lucian to it, that the bond had made her complicit in his survival, and she would treat that complicity like a profession and not a romance. The declaration changed the air the way a sudden pressure change can make ears ring, and Lucian's posture eased not into relief exactly, but into alignment, and he took one step back from the invisible line between them as if to honor the sovereignty she had just articulated, and in that gesture she saw the possibility that love, if it ever came, would come as a byproduct of honest work rather than as an anesthetic, and the thought steadied her so completely she almost missed the way one of the empty chairs flickered, and for a heartbeat showed a figure seated, veiled and still, a memory or a warning or an ancestor deciding whether to bless the experiment. They set a night for the council to meet, and the sanctuary breathed as if counting down. And in the days that followed, Mara learned the choreography of preparation, how to braid her hair in a way that would not invite the language of weakness from people who had forgotten how to read human resilience, how to lace her boots with no metal that silver could corrupt, how to stand on the sigil that made her voice carry without giving it the echo of a tyrant. And she learned how to take Lucian's hand in brief, functional contact that looked like logistics and felt like a promise, not to each other, but to the idea that mercy could outlast appetite if someone stubborn enough stood between them and insisted. On the evening appointed, the sanctuary filled with footsteps that stopped where they were meant to stop, and faces that carried histories like weapons, and a hum in the stone that signaled the oath had noticed and would remember. And Mara spoke, before any ancient mouth could claim the narrative, her words long and unwinding and careful, a tapestry rather than a banner. And when she finished, there was a silence so keen it might have cut them if it had lasted a second longer. A woman with hair the color of steel filings asked whether a human could be trusted not to sell the ring for a sad story and a handful of safety for her family, and Mara answered by removing the ring and letting it rest on the open page of the Ogun sanctuary ledger, and the iron did not cool to the paper. It sank a fraction into the script as if writing itself a new line. And then she put it back on, and the ledger kept the impression like a signature. No forgery could match, and the room understood that bargaining would have to learn new tricks. Not all were persuaded. Some faces hardened the way clay does when heat reveals its intended shape, and among them, Mara read a hunger for failure that could feed a century, and she knew enough now to detect the pattern of the coup as it softened. Around the edges, the way dissenters turned their bodies toward exits, as if rehearsing not retreat, but attack from a different angle. And in that minute of recognition, she also felt a smaller, colder sensation, a thread tugging from somewhere past the sanctuary's reach, an invitation spoken with her voice in a corner of the undertunnels, not here in the hall, but at the far periphery, a false call sewn with a few true fibers. And Lucian felt it too, because his head lifted like a stag catching. The scent of a trap, and the sigils along the outermost ring shuddered as if a hand had brushed their fur the wrong way. They did not run, because running would have announced fear to those who had come to measure it. Instead, Mara lifted her hand and said one word to the stone, the word he had taught her and she had not yet spent, the one that meant mine in a language invented to keep kings honest, and the sanctuary obeyed, veiling the approach like a fog that confuses shorelines. And she finished her sentence as if no thread pulled at her name from the dark, and she met the eyes of those who would betray, and gave them the gift of being seen. The midpoint of a life is never the exact center. It is the place where going back ceases to be an option. You can say out loud without lying. And as the council filed out under the watching of the stone, she understood that they had crossed it, together. No safe apartment or careful anonymity would be enough from here, because she had set her heel on the floor of a world that would either learn to grow gardens in the dark or try to salt every seed. And when Lucienne touched her wrist, afterward in the archway between nave and exit, the contact carried not triumph, but a vow. And she answered not with words, but with the steadiness of a pulse that had learned it could ring like a bell inside iron without shattering. And somewhere, beyond the thresholds, a traitor made a new plan with an old face, and promised the dark that the law of invitation would break if the mouth that spoke it bled enough. Night thickened, like ink poured too slowly to reach the floor, and the city above the buried cathedral did not notice the way its foundations began to hum with pressure, did not feel the tremor of something ancient preparing to test the rules written in its stone ribs. The council's meeting had ended with the brittle calm that often follows a fragile victory, and Mara had told herself that the worst was postponed rather than prevented. She believed it for 3 days, long enough to breathe without listening for footsteps in the tunnels, long enough to mistake exhaustion for peace. The hospital had called her back to overtime, and for the first time since she met Lucian, she went to work without the sense that the air itself was watching. Her hands remembered their craft. Her voice found its gentler rhythm again. For a few hours, she was almost herself, the woman who believed in small mercies performed beneath fluorescent light. Then, as she was checking an IV line, she saw her own reflection in the stainless steel door of the supply cabinet, and behind her reflection stood not the corridor, but a vaulted chamber, dripping with wax and blood, and a whisper in a voice nearly identical to hers said that the sanctuary's wards were failing, that Lucian had gone to reinforce the outer circle and would not return unless she came now. She blinked, and the vision vanished, but the ring on her hand burned cold, and she understood with dreadful precision that the message had been meant to mimic the bond, to use her own tone as a key. By the time she reached the tunnels, the air smelled of ozone and ash, the scent of wards under siege. The sanctuary's sigils pulsed a dull red, the color of overstrained muscle, and she found Lucian on the dais, one knee bent, one hand pressed against the floor, as if he were trying to hold the earth together by sheer will. His coat was torn, and his eyes had taken on that unearthly brightness she had seen once before, the gleam that meant he was not entirely present in this century. The moment she stepped across the threshold, the pressure shifted, the ring flared, and the stone exhaled like a body that had been waiting for its pulse to return. He looked up, not with relief, but with warning, and said her name as if he were trying to keep it intact while the world broke. She did not ask what was happening. The answer was visible in the way the light bled through the cracks of the sigils. The traitor had found a way to bypass the rule of invitation, using a human intermediary, a beggar boy taken from the river district and taught to speak her name, while his veins carried a fragment of her blood, stolen from a discarded gauze. It was enough to trick the outer ring into confusion, enough to let the enemy breach the first layer of the wards. Lucian told her that the intruders were still held between circles, caught in a corridor of paradox where each step forward aged them a decade, and each step back erased their memory. But the spell was degrading, and if they forced a passage, the backlash would collapse the sanctuary entirely. He needed to reinforce the core, and for that he required her help. The ritual demanded balance between mortal and immortal essence, the same equation that had once awakened him. He warned her that it would hurt. She said that pain was only a language, and she was ready to learn it. They knelt together in the center of the sigil floor, their hands almost touching, but not quite, the ring bridging the distance with its light. He began to speak in a tongue that tasted like rust and snow, and she felt the vibration move through the stone into her bones. The sanctuary responded, awakening its memory of old kings and older laws, and the sigils ignited one by one in concentric circles until the hall blazed like the interior of a star. The pain came then, sharp and clean, starting in her palm and running up her arm like a line of molten silver. She did not scream. She let the sound travel inward instead, turning it into fuel. Through the glare, she saw figures at the far edge of the light, shapes that twisted and reformed like smoke, struggling to become human. The traitor was among them, his face half familiar, half ruined by ambition. Lord Varric, once Lucian's general, now returned as the mouthpiece of every grudge that had survived the centuries. He carried a spear forged from the remnants of the same curse that had once sealed Lucian, its head humming with contained venom. Varric called out across the chamber, offering her the safety of mortality if she would abandon the bond and surrender the ring. He promised her freedom from nightmares, a life restored to ordinary limits, a forgetting that would taste like peace. The temptation struck like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, she imagined herself back at the hospital, anonymous, unburdened, alive in the small way ordinary people are alive. Then she looked at Lucian, his hand trembling under the weight of power he refused to unleash against a former friend, and she understood that freedom without memory was just another form of death. She rose, still shaking, and walked toward the outer circle. Lucien called after her, but the bond made his voice sound distant, as though time itself hesitated to let him interfere. She told Varric that she would hear him out if he crossed the line himself. He smiled, thinking it a trap for her, not for him, and stepped forward. The instant his boot touched the inner ring, the sanctuary recognized the false blood in the boy who had spoken her name. The wards retaliated. Lightning without heat exploded across the floor, freezing the intruders in silhouettes of ash. But Varric's spear remained, embedded in the air, as if the world could not decide whether to let it fall. It quivered once, twice, then shot forward, driven by a remnant of its maker's will. Lucian moved faster than vision, intercepting it, but the spearhead grazed his chest before he could shatter it. The contact was enough. The poison in the weapon bloomed through him like ink in water, dark tendrils spreading under his skin. He staggered, catching himself on the edge of the dais. The light in his eyes dimmed, and the sigils faltered. Mara ran to him, catching his shoulders, feeling the unnatural cold radiating through his body. The poison was old magic, designed to corrupt regeneration into decay. It would turn his immortality against him, making his body feed on its own strength until nothing remained. He told her to leave, to seal the sanctuary behind her, to let the curse consume only him. She refused. She remembered the day she had found him half dead in the alley, the way he had said that mercy had teeth. She had chosen once to heal what the undead could not, and she would choose it again. She tore the bandage from his chest, where the wound smoked faintly. The blood beneath was not red, but the color of midnight glass. Without thinking, she pressed her hand against it. The ring burned so hot she smelled her own skin sear, and then the pain vanished, replaced by a surge of energy that was not hers. The poison entered her through the contact, flooding her veins with frost. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, each pulse heavier, more deliberate, as if time itself were thickening. Lucian tried to pull away, but she locked her fingers in the wound and said, in a voice that did not belong entirely to her, that the bond was a loop, and loops could be rewired. The sanctuary trembled, the sigils shifting into new configurations that neither of them had ever seen. The light rose until the world dissolved into brilliance. When sight returned, she was on the floor, and Lucienne was beside her, breathing raggedly. The poison had retreated from his body, drawn into hers. She felt it moving under her skin, searching for a shape to destroy, and finding none. Her human cells resisted for as long as they could, then began to adapt, not dying, but changing, weaving the venom into something new. Lucienne realized what was happening and told her to stop, to let him take it back, but she could not. The process was beyond intention. The ring fused to her hand, its metal spreading in delicate veins along her wrist like living circuitry. Her heart shuddered, then steadied into a rhythm that matched his. Outside the sanctuary, the city's lights flickered, and every creature with a drop of ancient blood felt the pulse of a new law being written. The traitors' surviving allies fled into the tunnels, pursued by echoes of their own screams. Lucian gathered Mara in his arms, whispering that she had done what no healer should have to do, that her compassion had outstripped the architecture of nature. She was barely conscious, her eyes unfocused, her skin luminous with fever. He carried her to the center of the hall and laid her on the sigil floor, which still glowed faintly. The ring's veins on her arm pulsed with light, each beat synchronizing with the resonance of the sanctuary. He tried to call the old magic that could restore her, but every incantation rebounded. The bond had evolved beyond language. The poison that should have killed her had become a bridge between worlds. He felt her heartbeat inside his own chest, slow but defiant. The realization terrified him. If she died, the loop would collapse, taking him with it. If she lived, she would never again be entirely human. Her breath grew shallow. She whispered that the light hurt her eyes, and he dimmed it without words, simply by willing the sanctuary to darken. Then the sound came. Stone cracking, sigils shattering like mirrors dropped from height. The enemy was returning, not as soldiers, but as shadow, a swarm of shapes too thin for flesh and too hungry for reason. The sanctuary's outer defenses were gone. The betrayal had succeeded enough to leave the gates half open. Lucian stood, leaving her lying in the faint ring of light, and faced the advancing dark. He summoned the remainder of his strength, calling on every ounce of authority the crown had once given him. The shadows paused, uncertain, their forms flickering between memory and malice. He commanded them to retreat in the name of the law that had built this place. For a moment they obeyed. Then Varric's voice spoke through them, a chorus of mockery. The law, it said, was rewritten. The living had no right to guard the dead. Mara stirred, hearing the words as though they were being spoken inside her blood. The ring on her hand brightened again, but the light this time was golden rather than white, warm rather than cold. She raised her hand weakly, and the air around her shifted. The golden glow expanded until it touched Lucian's back, wrapping him in radiance. He turned, astonished, and saw that the veins of metal along her arm had spread to her throat, tracing lines that looked like script written in sunlight. She said, barely audible, that he was not alone, that she could see the pattern now, the way every curse was just a misalignment of compassion and fear, the way every seal could be undone by the same hand that forged it if that hand remembered mercy. The golden light flared outward, passing through Lucian into the oncoming shadows. Where it touched them, they dissolved, not in fire or agony, but in silence, as if they had been waiting to be unmade. Varric's voice howled once, then faded into the echo of his own ambition. When the light faded, the sanctuary was empty except for them. The air smelled of dust and rain. Lucian turned back to her, kneeling. She looked different. Paler, yes, but also sharper, as though the boundaries of her humanity had been redrawn in fine gold lines. He touched her cheek, and his hand did not chill her. She was warm now, warmer than any human had a right to be. She told him that she could hear the city above them, every heartbeat, every whisper of wind against glass. She could feel the pulse of life as a single vast rhythm, neither human nor immortal, but both. He said that the transformation might not stop there, that she might become something the world had no language for. She smiled faintly and said that perhaps the world needed new words. Then her body convulsed, and the warmth turned to fever again. The ring's light flared so brightly that Lucian had to shield his eyes. He begged her to hold on, to stay with him, but her voice had already changed, layered with tones that did not belong to a mortal throat. She told him that the sanctuary was not dying. It was waking, and through it, she could see what he had been and what he might become. He realized too late what she intended. The ring was channeling the entire structure's remaining power into her body. She was sealing the breach from within, using herself as the keystone. He tried to stop her, but an invisible barrier held him back. The sigils rose from the floor, swirling around her like constellations breaking orbit. She looked at him one last time, her eyes clear and impossibly bright, and said that every bond demands its price, but this one would pay forward instead of backward. The light swallowed her, and the world went silent. When the brilliance faded, the sigils were whole again, unbroken, their lines humming with new strength. The sanctuary stood untouched, restored. But where she had lain, there was only the ring, floating above the floor like an ember. Lucian reached for it, but before his fingers closed, the air rippled, and the ember melted into his palm, leaving a mark shaped like her heartbeat. The bond had not ended. It had moved. He could feel her presence inside the walls, in the vibrations of the stone, in the soft thrum of the sigils. She was not gone, not exactly. She had become the sanctuary's pulse. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by a grief so vast it almost resembled awe. He spoke her name, and the echo answered. Not a voice, but a sensation, a warmth spreading through the air. He understood then that the sacrifice had not been death, but transfiguration. She had given the sanctuary her mortality, so that its doors would forever open to compassion and close to fear. From that moment, no creature, human or immortal, could enter seeking conquest without being turned away by their own reflection. Lucian remained there until the dawn seeped through cracks far above, the first sunlight the sanctuary had seen in centuries, and when it touched his skin, it did not burn. He realized that her final act had rewritten more than walls and sigils. It had rewritten him. He walked out of the cathedral, into the light that had once been forbidden, the air tasting of iron and dawn. The city was waking, unaware that a war had been postponed beneath its feet. In the east, the sky blushed with the color of blood turned merciful. Behind him, the sanctuary breathed once more, and somewhere within its heart, her voice whispered through the stone, steady as a pulse. "You're alive. Don't waste it." He whispered back to the air, promising he wouldn't. Then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in a millennium, the King of the Night felt the warmth of morning without fear. The city's morning peeled open like a pale fruit and bled light into places that had not known it for centuries. And Lucian walked within that light without the old pain, feeling the sanctuary's new heartbeat rise through the stone into his bones. Like a tide that recognized him not as master, but as kin, and he understood with a clarity that scalded more than sunlight ever had, that the grace he wore was borrowed from the woman who had chosen to become a law rather than a legend, and that borrowed things must be accounted for before the day ends. Above ground, the whispers had already turned to proclamations, because a king seen in daylight is a story that outruns hoofbeats, and the factions that fed on myth and fear could not afford the story to live. So they gathered in the longest hall left to the court, under a ceiling painted with battles that none of them had fought, and they named what they meant to do with euphemisms polished by centuries. Words like continuity and remedial succession and necessary pruning, and they summoned the loyalists by threat, the undecided by shame, and the hungry by scent. And when Lucian came, he did not come as Shadow, because shadows were their craft, and he would not kneel to his enemy's vocabulary. He came as the aftertaste of dawn, as a man who had learned the cost of being a symbol and was prepared to pay it in coin, minted from his own certainty. And when he crossed the threshold, he did not bring weapons, because he had carried too many. But he did bring the mark on his palm where the ring had melted into him, an ember-shaped scar that pulsed in time with the floor beneath their feet. And as he took his place, not on the throne, but in front of it, the hall that had rehearsed a coup learned what it means for architecture to take sides. They demanded explanations the way starving men demand bread, each voice a carefully honed blade thrown at his composure, and he answered them without roar or flourish, telling them that the breach below had been sealed, not by force, but by an arithmetic of mercy, that their traitor's spear had failed because poison cannot teach stone to forget, that he stood in daylight by the same covenant that forbade him from abandoning those who tended to the living, and that if they sought proof, he would grant it in the only currency his kind had never learned to counterfeit, which was the willingness to bow where pride is ordinarily nailed to the spine. And then he bowed, not to the throne, and not to the portraits, and not to the council's surviving dignity, but to the empty air directly before him. And in that air, the faintest shimmer began, a dilation of brightness, like breath taken in slowly by the world. And the tremor that ran along the floorboards was not fear. It was recognition, because the sanctuary's pulse had followed him into the room and discovered that walls are only agreements, pretending to be stone. The light thickened without glare, a warm weight that reached toward the mark in his palm and learned the path of his veins and borrowed the memory of his shape, the way water learns a riverbed. And the court saw the impossible take on edges, like a statue being carved from absence. And as the edges gathered, Mara came back, not by the old root of flesh returned to flesh, but by the new root she had cut for herself through oath and architecture. Her first breath did not sound like a drowning woman surfacing. It sounded like a building settling after an earthquake, a long exhale that told the room it had been remade to hold what it had previously excluded. And she stood beside him, not as a ghost, and not as a miracle, but as a consequence, alive with the same warmth that had sung the shadows into surrender below. And for a long moment, no one spoke, because even those who had planned to sneer found their mouths disobedient in the presence of a geometry that refused to be mocked. The nearest lord recovered himself first and called her abomination, as if the word were a lever that could pry the world back into the old shape. And Lucienne turned to him with a patience that made silence dangerous and told him, very simply, that the only blasphemy left to fear is the worship of hunger, and that he would not permit it to wear law as a mask any longer. Then he asked the room to witness an unthinkable act, and when the room leaned forward to taste scandal, he opened his wrist with a nail and let a line of his blood thread down into her waiting palm, and every elder present hissed, because their mythology had forbidden such mingling between the living and the dayborn they did not yet have words for, and yet the blood did not spark or boil or ruin. It steadied. It darkened into a wine-stained gold. It braided itself with the light running beneath her skin until the shimmer stilled, and her balance found a center it could trust. And the bond that had been a loop of iron and oath became a loop of breath and vow, a fusion neither feeding nor enthrallment, but an equal exchange signed in heat. And when the ripple of revulsion reached the doors did not open to let it out, because the building had chosen, and the building had learned to love its own change. Wordcraft failed the rebels as weapons had failed them in the tunnels, and in that gap, where language stuttered, Mara began to speak, not like a queen and not like a litigant, but like a nurse reading vitals aloud in a room where denial is a habit and honesty is anesthesia, and the body will not survive another hour of lying. And she told them what would be real by sunset, whether or not they voted to approve it. That the old practices of hunting in fear's shadow would end at the edges of human need, that hospitals and shelters and the streets around them would be sacrosanct, that no consent would be engineered through glamour or debt, that the night would remain generous to those who asked rather than took, and that any vampire who harmed a human offering aid to their kind would find the law awake and personal as a hand closing around a throat that has just decided to lie again. And with each sentence, the mark in Lucian's palm answered her with a thrum, and the floor under the council's feet answered him with a chord. And the sound was not music and not threat. It was a tuning, the way a city's lights come back in a grid after a blackout, and everyone breathes because they remember that electricity is just lightning that has learned to behave. Varric was not among them, because ambition had dissolved when the golden light found the shadow he had been using as armor, but he lived a little in the faces of those who still calculated profit against peace, and when they rose to object, they found their objections strangely empty, not because eloquence had abandoned them, but because the story they had believed about themselves had lost its rhythm. One by one they faltered, and into that faltering stepped an elder whose voice had not trembled in 2 centuries, the same elder who in the sanctuary days ago had leaned on a cane and asked What sort of king would rule them if raised by humans? And he set the cane aside now, and went down on one knee, and he did not kneel to blood, or radiance, or even to transformation. He knelt to the argument, to the way it had refused flattery and chosen articulation, and as his knee touched stone, the others remembered instincts older than their contempt, and some went down awkwardly, and some with theatrical grace, and some remained standing, because pride makes statues of men and turns them into museums, and Lucian forbade triumph from entering his face, because victory that humiliates will be answered by the patience of knives. And he lifted the elder to his feet, and named him Keeper of Thresholds, the first new office the court had seen in an age, charged with measuring invitations against intent and teaching doors to hesitate until mercy caught up. The reckoning that followed did not splash blood across the mosaics, because spectacle would only have trained the wrong appetite. Instead, they read names into the record, like diagnoses, and prescribed punishments that tasted like rehabilitation. Rather than revenge, exile to the border towns where human commerce had been scabbed over by rumor and needed stitching. Service in clinics hidden beneath cathedrals, restoration of cemeteries where the hungry had not been careful, audits of ancient debts owed to families who had kept silence because their grandmothers had loved monsters and refused to regret it, and for those who had positioned themselves as patient spiders at the heart of the web and would burn the web rather than share it. For them, the sentence was older and simpler, a sealing away in cells cut not from stone, but from story. Rooms that would tell them their own histories until truth finally became unbearable or comforting, and either way, safe. When someone shouted that this was not justice, Mara asked what justice they had offered to a dying stranger in an alley, and the shout went out of the voice like breath from a punctured lung. The decree was signed, not with wax, but with the mark in Lucian's palm pressed against the parchment until the ember shape was burned into the fibers, and beneath it, Mara placed her hand and the gold-veined script that had traced itself along her. Wrist inked the page without ink, a line of brightness that did not fade, and the hall understood that signatures come in many temperatures, and that some are warmer than others because they promise work rather than authority. Outside, news traveled ahead of language, as it always does when a border moves. The shelters felt the pressure shift first, a noon wind threading through their doors that carried no scent of threat, and nurses on break found street corner arguments, cooling faster than tempers should allow, and men with old reasons to fear. The dark walked through it, and came out thinking of breakfast rather than prayer, and beneath it all the sanctuary hummed, not sleeping, but dreaming in the useful way stone. Dreams, adjusting its bones so that other places could borrow its spine. When the business of the hall ended at last, after the brief ritual of feeding that tasted of covenant rather than hunger, Lucienne and Mara stood in the vestibule between shadow and street, and tried on silence as if it were a garment they could afford, and he told her that the Forbidden Act had not damned her as the old stories promised. It had anchored her, that his blood had not colonized her. It had learned a different gravity inside the light she had become, and she answered that she had not saved him to be sanctified. She had saved him because one person in a city of millions should always be able to change the forecast. And if their myth helped others try, then the myth had earned its supper. He asked whether she wanted a title, because courts cannot resist labeling what they fear and love. And she said that names should be functions, or songs, not pedestals. But if he must, then let it be something that teaches even when whispered. And he smiled with the surprise of a man who has remembered that he has a mouth for smiling. And he called her Dawn-bearer, not a queen and not a saint, a steward of mornings, and the word ran ahead of them into the streets and found ears ready for it. They went out together into the afternoon that had once been forbidden to him, and the light reached for their faces without cruelty, and when she took his hand, there in public, where rumor could feast on the gesture, it was not romance for the sake of theater. It was logistics. Balance learned at last, a weight shared so that neither of them had to tilt toward pain, and the city noticed in the way a city does, which is to say, it pretended to be indifferent while quietly revising 1,000 small behaviors, and above their heads a skein of pigeons arrowed toward a roofline where weeds had turned to herbs overnight, and far below their feet, in the cooled heart of the world, the sanctuary listened for trouble and heard only the curious murmur of a future assembling itself from better materials than fear. The city awoke into a season that had no precedent, the slow kind of rebirth that does not announce itself with fanfare, but with the cumulative hush of things beginning to heal, and each dawn now unfolded like a lesson in how to live without the old reflex of flinching from light, because the light no longer accused, it simply observed. In the weeks that followed the council's reckoning, rumors multiplied, as rumors do when truth is too large to fit into any single telling, and every version disagreed with every other except on one point, that somewhere between midnight and morning Foao-eyed for, man who could not endure daylight had walked into it and remained, and beside him a woman who had once been ordinary had held out her hand, and the sun itself had answered. The skeptics in government offices tried to explain it as coordinated illusion, the scholars as an allegory, the clergy as a misinterpretation of prophecy, and the young as proof that perhaps the world had not yet run out of firsts. But for those who lived close enough to the border between shadow and survival, where small kindnesses are the only currency that matters, there was no need for explanation, because they felt the change in the air itself, the way darkness stopped biting, the way despair began to forget its own name. Lucian moved through these new mornings like a man relearning balance after years in a cage. The light did not burn him, but it humbled him. Every reflection startled him with its lack of menace, as though mirrors had been waiting centuries for his forgiveness. He did not rebuild the old court in its old shape. He dismantled its hierarchy piece by piece and replaced it with something porous, an architecture of cooperation rather than control, inviting humans into its lowest councils and tasking immortals with listening before speaking. The ancient halls beneath the city became places of study and healing, their walls inscribed not with the victories of tyrants, but with the procedures of empathy. The hospitals above began to receive quiet donations, untraceable but steady, ensuring that no night shift ever ran short of blood supplies again. The shelters learned to leave a single candle burning at their doors, a silent signal to any creature wandering hungry that the flame was not a trap, but a truce. The world adapted faster than fear expected. Mara watched all this with the distance of one who exists in several places at once. The bond that had saved the sanctuary bound her now to the rhythm of the earth itself, and though her body looked almost human, her senses had expanded into a geography too wide for rest. She could hear the heartbeat of the city like a great living organ, could feel when hatred flared in one quarter and when compassion answered it in another, and her task became one of subtle calibration, an invisible kind of stewardship. She often stood at the edge of the reservoir, where the water reflected the skyline like a second, softer reality, and when people passed, they felt an unreasoned calm, the instinctive recognition that something vast and watchful cared whether they continued. Lucian visited her there at dusk, when the boundary between their worlds thinned enough for conversation to flow easily. They rarely spoke of the past. Their dialogue was practical, the way of two physicians comparing notes about a patient they both loved. He told her that the younger vampires had begun volunteering in hospitals under false names, that the crime rate had fallen in districts once considered lost, that the moon itself seemed to rise with less suspicion. She told him of the voices of stone and tree, of how the sanctuary's echoes had begun to spread beyond its walls, infusing other forgotten places with the courage to stay intact. They both understood that the work was only beginning. There were setbacks, of course. Some who had survived the purge of the old order withdrew into the deep provinces, plotting restoration. Others, human and immortal alike, found the absence of enemies unbearable and tried to invent new ones. But even rebellion changed its texture. The weapons they raised turned to ash when fueled by pure hatred, as though the world itself had rewritten its chemistry. The more clever dissidents learned to redirect their ambition toward creation, discovering that art and governance could satisfy the same hunger as domination if one listened long enough. The legend of the Dayborn and the king became less a story about salvation and more a parable about cooperation. Children began to play at it in the streets, one standing in sunlight, one in shadow, their hands meeting in the air between them, while they chanted the refrain that rumor had condensed from truth. Two hearts, one dawn. As for Mara and Lucienne, their bond matured into a silence more eloquent than vows. They did not live together, nor apart, because the line between them had ceased to matter. When he visited the sanctuary, he found her presence woven through its corridors, the golden veins on the walls pulsing in time with her unseen heartbeat. When she walked in the city, she found traces of him in every act of courage performed without. Witness, they had become each other's continuum, a living argument against division. Sometimes, standing on the cathedral roof at twilight, he would feel her hand in the wind and hear her whisper that redemption is not an event, but a maintenance schedule. And he would laugh because even transfigured, she spoke like a nurse reminding a patient to take his medicine. The laughter itself became a benediction, echoing off the rooftops like music that refused to end on a minor chord. Years passed, or seemed to. Time lost its edges around them. The human world grew slightly kinder, and when cruelty appeared, it no longer strutted as certainty, but slunk as error, correctable and small. The vampires adapted to scarcity, not as punishment, but as discipline, learning that restraint could taste as rich as indulgence once the memory of suffering was shared rather than hoarded. New generations grew up hearing of a night that ended not in fire, but in light, and they carried that image into their art, their laws, their lullabies. The bond between species held, fragile but persistent, like a scar that refuses to fade because it keeps the skin honest. And under it all, the sanctuary continued to breathe, its stone warmed by an internal sun, its sigils alive with slow intelligence, its pulse matching the rhythm of the world above. On the anniversary of the day the sun first touched his face without pain, Lucian returned to the alley where she had found him, now cleaned and paved, a mural of rising light painted on its walls by hands that would never know whom they honored. He knelt there for a long time, feeling the warmth on the back of his neck, and when he finally spoke, it was not to the air, but to the echo of her presence that shimmered in every particle of light. He thanked her not for saving him, but for teaching him to be worth saving, and the answer came in the smallest of breezes that lifted the edge of his coat and whispered through the new leaves above. Keep going. He stood, and the day moved around, him like a tide following its moon. Somewhere far below, in the sanctum's heart, a pulse matched his, steady and unafraid. Thus the world, once divided by thirst and terror, learned a new equilibrium. Dawn became a covenant rather than a boundary, night a refuge rather than a sentence. The story of the girl and the king passed into legend, then into ritual, then into instinct, until even those who no longer remembered names still lived by its moral, offering compassion before fear and finding again and again that it worked. And when the sun rose each morning over the city that had once trembled at its own shadow, its light touched stone and water and flesh alike with the same gentle impartiality, as if blessing them for having finally remembered that to be alive at all is already a kind of mercy.